Hi there, this is John Epstein from Sentient, and I'm glad to welcome you all to our webinar today, Biometrics and CRO Explored. Subtitle is Who Cares What Your Customers Think? It's How They Feel. And our panelists today include myself, next slide, and also Mr. Alex Ford, who is Head of Business Development for Space Between, an agency. Alex, how's it going?
Hi, John. Yeah, it's going really well. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us today.
Excellent. And Alex, a reminder, you're in control of the slides.
Yes. Okay, so I think we've got everyone here, so I'll kick off. So there you go. You can put some faces to names.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. Let's get the commercials out of the way. This webinar is brought to you by Sentient. Sentient is a new and powerful tool for conversion optimization that's based around evolutionary AI and offers the ability to accelerate and automate testing and experimentation as compared to traditional A/B or multivariate testing, and is a very rapid testing environment and one that is always adapting. The tests that you can run with Ascend can be very large, testing anywhere from 10 to 30 or 40 changes all at once across a single page or an entire funnel, and Ascend automates the process. And that'll be it for the commercial messages here. The goal today is really to explore how one of Sentient's partners, Space Between, combined biometric analysis into a very interesting and illuminating conversion optimization experiment. So Alex, over to you. Tell us about Space Between.
Yeah, sure. So Space Between, we are a conversion rate focused agency based in the south of England, down in Kent. And we work with Sentient as our kind of A/B tool of choice to develop tests for some of our clients. So we're going to be talking about HRGo PLC today, which is a recruitment company that we do some work with. And we've got a biometrics lab that we use, which is one of the only ones in the country. And what that allows us to do is to get real tangible data from focus groups, as opposed to traditional ways of running kind of a UX focus group of interviewing attendees. We actually get data from their subconscious behavior, and that allows us to formulate ideas and plans for A/B tests. So you've got some of the services there that we offer, and today we'll be kind of looking at digital consumer psychology and obviously machine learning that Sentient brings to us. So some of our clients, HRGo, as we mentioned, but also going to be bringing in some examples from another case study that we did with ASOS a couple of weeks ago. So we ran the biometric lab with them. So there's a couple of slides from that session. So I guess a lot of you are thinking, what is a biometrics lab? It sounds kind of fancy, but what actually is it? So on the screen you can see a picture of the setup. So on the right hand side, if you imagine running kind of a user experience focus group, you would invite your customers or potential customers down and you'd rig them up to this machine. So we've got an EEG machine which monitors kind of brain waves and thought patterns. You've got eye trackers, you've got facial recognition, and then you've got GSR, which is galvanic skin response. So we are measuring how much somebody is sweating, their heart rate, and we're collecting all of this data in real time as they interact with the stimuli. So in this case, that might be your e-commerce website. And we might set a challenge for somebody, go and buy a pair of blue jeans for under £100, or go and buy a red dress for a Saturday night out. And then we would kind of record that whole process and collect all of this biometric data. On the left,
Alex,
sorry, John.
Alex, when you think about the different devices here in the lab, what is the sort of signal you get from each of them? What do you, obviously eye tracking, shows you where someone's looking, so you can look at attention on the page. What are the other, what are the inputs? How do you, what's an EEG tell you different than galvanic skin response, for example?
Okay, so eye tracking, for example, is a really good one, because I'm sure a lot of people involved in the kind of UX space have used like heat mapping tools and mouse tracking tools. Eye tracking showing where the eyes are darting all over the screen, and what we found is that the eyes are basically making the decisions before the mouse even moves. And then in terms of like GSR and facial expressions, so facial expressions allow us to pick up on minute changes. So whether you're, in extreme cases, frowning quite heavily, or if you're smiling, but even things like if you open your mouth slightly, if you raise your chin, all of these kind of small changes in behavior give us an indication to what you might be feeling. So are you slightly confused? Are you slightly anxious? Are you paying specific attention to a certain area? And then the GSR gives us an indicator of how valid that is. So it might be a small change, but if your heart rate has also gone up quite a lot and you started to sweat quite a lot, we're talking about micro changes here. But if we see an increase in that helps us kind of validate the other data that we're getting from facial expression and EEG. So EEG is the last one, which monitors brain waves and signals in your brain. Speaking openly and honestly, it's one of the lower indicators. So that's kind of another one that validates the other 4 or 5 inputs that we have there.
Cool stuff.
Yeah. So that's what we do. So for HR Go, for example, we found a subset of their customers. So in their case, it was 8 people. And we use 8 people because that's kind of what's recommended by YouGov before you start seeing like repeats in your patterns of data. And we sat them down and we gave them all a challenge. And in their case, the challenge was find a job and apply for it. So I spoke a little bit there about what biometrics is, but how can we use it to understand website visitors' experience? Hopefully now understanding a little bit about biometrics, you can see that if a visitor is looking at a certain component on your page or a certain element of your page, and they're looking at it for a really long time, if they're frowning at it, you can see that they're kind of confused or angry or surprised. Basically indicates to you that there's an issue with that area of your site. And that's kind of the key use of biometrics, is that historically, when you run kind of user experience sessions, it's reliant on a team of designers or a team of kind of product owners or various different stakeholders to define and come up with areas that they think need addressing or aren't as good as it can be. Using biometrics, we're able to kind of completely flip that on its head, get your real customers in, and then get the data which tells us which areas we should be actually testing on. So that's how we use biometrics with kind of Sentient to actually find the areas that we should be testing better.
Traditionally, people would use tools like heat maps or click maps, certainly look at the analytics for a site and how do bounce off pages or click from, which links they're clicking on. How do you combine the bio? Do you use both techniques? Do you use one versus the other? And do they match up?
Yeah, so we wouldn't say this is a replacement for. This is kind of like another tool in your toolbox. So yeah, heat maps and click tracking are all data inputs that we would definitely use. But this kind of gives us the real subconscious behavior. So the analogy that we often use, I don't know what it's like over there in the US, but over here in the UK, our hairdressers and barbers are really quite chatty. And one analogy that we give is, you go to the same barbers for years and years, he cuts your hair and you know, one week he might not give you the best haircut you've ever had, but at the end of it, he gets the mirror out and he shows you, you know, the back of your head and says, hey, how's the haircut this week? And you're like, hey, John, you know, that was great. Thanks again. You know, that was a great haircut. Here's a tip. And you leave and you get straight on the phone to your wife or your partner and you say, God, he's messed my hair up. You know, he's cut it really badly. And that's what we found with biometrics is, whilst we might be saying one thing, kind of subconsciously we might be feeling or thinking another thing. So anyone who's kind of ever run like focus groups will probably know that one of the hardest challenges is actually interviewing people in the right way to get the information out of them. So yeah, using biometrics, we can, with other tools, we can really get down to the subconscious level, which isn't something that other tools like heat mapping and click tracking, for example, allows you to do. But they're still great tools that we also use on top of biometrics.
Got it.
Cool. So I guess this plays on to like, how do you actually make use of this technology and ultimately turn it into you know, improvements in your user experience. So Harry Selfridge, the Selfridges group, said, you know, the customer's always right, but our evidence kind of shows that they will lie to you. And it's not always intentionally. A lot of the times it's subconsciously. And in a lot of our tests, you know, when we interview people, we say, hey, you know, how do you find that element? How do you find that add to cart button, for example? And say, oh, it's nice or it's okay, but what does okay or good really mean? And the biometrics allows us to say, well, actually, you showed 800 milliseconds of frustration, or you showed 600 milliseconds of anger. Like, that's okay. What were you angry about? And they might say, I couldn't quite read the text, or I don't know, whatever it might be. So that's what we mean. By that. And the thing that we found with some of the brands that we're working on is that, as anyone kind of in merchandising probably knows, consumers make decisions really, really, really quickly. So kind of research shown that your subconscious brain is making up to 90% of the decisions, and your conscious brain is only making about 10% of the decisions. Because we process information via our subconscious brain a lot quicker than we do in our conscious brain. And there's loads of studies to kind of support this and back this up. This one here that we've got pulled out that your subconscious brain is processing kind of 20,000 bits of information versus roughly 7 bits plus or minus 2 for the conscious mind. So you can see that lots of little things like, you know, colors, fonts, padding, spacing, can affect, you know, users' behavior. And we've got some examples of those in the case study a little bit later on, which was a bit of a surprise for us as well. Is that all making sense so far, John?
No, it's great. It's powerful stuff. I mean, I'm thinking, you know, I think it's easy to think that people make decisions consciously, but, you know, we know from certainly, you know, when you're involved in a sales discussion, that it's much more important that people emotionally bond. And I think the same is true with a website or a digital experience as well. And so I did not know that the subconscious had such massive parallel processing capabilities. So it looks like it can read a lot. Talk to us more about how you applied this and the types of data that you see from this kind of testing.
Yeah, sure. So when we run kind of one of these biometric lab sessions, as you can imagine, we get so much data out of it. We can actually track 72 different data points and 72 different sets of emotions. And what that gives us really is what we call areas of conversion interest. So it's areas that we feel are most likely to result in a positive impact on your conversion rate, whether that be, you know, e-commerce, recruitment. And what that allows you to do is very, very quickly get to the point where you're working on the right element, or you're working on the right component of your site. So, rather than kind of spending a bit of time trying to find out, which area should we work on? Is it our checkout flow? Is it our product page? Is it our home page? Is it the image? Do we need to make that bigger? Is it the add to basket? Very, very quickly, you can get to the point of saying, look, all of our people got frustrated or angry at this point, so we know we need to address something here. Let's run some tests in this area of conversion interest. So that's kind of one way we use the data for defining CRO tests and getting there quite quickly. The other way that we use it, and our lead UX designer Octavian here likes it, is for his prototypes. So I don't know if anyone uses kind of InVision or any of those rapid prototyping pieces of software, but we can also use those in the lab. So if you're coming up with a new product or you're coming up with a new set of designs, you can actually test those very, very early on, rather than having to go through the whole development cycle of developing them, putting them on a development site, launching them, testing them. You can actually bring that process nearer to the beginning. And so if you find any kind of anomalies in the data there, you can change tack should you need to.
Do you find it's easier to get, you have people wearing a lot of stuff. Is it easier to get people to participate in a sort of normal focus group, or is it hard to get people to put on all the gear and do the tests, or are they excited by the prospect? What's your experience?
Yeah, so that's one of the biggest challenges. So, and that's one of the reasons actually that quite often we'll choose to maybe do a first test without the EEG cat, because that is quite an intrusive device. So other than the EEG cat, the only other device is the GSR, which goes on either your left or your right hand, which is quite unintrusive. So sometimes we'll run it without the cat for that very reason. But one of the challenges is about making the people feel comfortable in the setting. I mean, the ideal is, getting people feel like they're in their own home and they're super relaxed, but that's not always possible. But we try things like, for example, we don't call them tests when we're talking to candidates, because that makes it feel like they're being tested, but it's not really a kind of a pass or fail situation. It's just, we're collecting some information. We have background music playing. We do it in quite an informal setting, but our experience has shown that most people are quite open to it and quite excited by it, because it is new. I mean, tomorrow, a bit of inside information, we're actually taking the lab to a theme park here in the UK in the middle of kind of a big holiday, and we're going to be kind of grabbing people out of the crowd and doing some guerrilla UX testing. But the lab is portable, so we can take it. We can set it up in our environment, or we can take it to theme parks, for example, or one of our clients who's a true omni-channel retailer. So they've got bricks and mortar stores, and they've got a strong online presence. We actually take the lab to their stores, to one of their stores, and we say to people in the store, hey, have you got 20 minutes to spare to run through some tests? We'll give you £50 off your purchase today. And people are quite open to that. They like that. And, you ask them questions, hey, why are you in the store today rather than buying online? And we've been able to get some good data from kind of actually moving the lab around.
Cool. Let's drill down into some of that data.
Yeah. Okay. So, so this next slide is part of the ASOS study that I was talking about. So this is kind of one picture from a study we did on their product page. So here you've got men's slim fit blue jeans, and you can see all the elements are kind of marked up. So the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. indicate in which pattern people's eyes fixated on each element. So you can see the first one is obviously the main picture. The second one is the video. The third one is the size, which sometimes quite surprising. And then the fourth one is the other images, and so on and so forth. All the yellow elements is kind of the data crunched crunched down. So time to first fixation is how long does it take somebody to fixate on that element on your page, and this is eye tracking. So product image 0.1 seconds, very, very quick. But the add to cart button is almost 10 seconds. So there's 10 seconds there of kind of people processing information before they actually make a decision to even look at the add to basket or add to bag button. And then interestingly as well, there's also some other elements that people only ever look at once. So, for example, number 7, which is the price, that often shocks a few people when we run these tests, that the price is the 7th thing that people look at. They look at everything else before they look at the price. And also, whilst 4 people looked at it, only 50% of those looked at it more than once. So 2 people looked at it once, and then 2 people looked at it only twice. Which goes to show that it's an important piece of information, but once the kind of customer's got it, it's not that important to the customer because they can retain that in their short-term memory. So yeah, this is kind of an example of the report, and you can use this data here to make design decisions. So some of the outcome of this one is that the size chart, a lot of people spent 3.1 seconds on that element. That's quite a lot of time when you look at some of the other elements that are kind of 0.5 seconds, 0.4 seconds. So 3.1 seconds on the size chart, and then revisit. So 5 out of 5 people revisited that. So that's a key element where running tests could prove quite successful for this client.
Oh, you mentioned you have 72 streams of data, and obviously there's a lot of data here. How do you sort of narrow it down and go from this to a concrete set of hypotheses? What skills are required to do that in this?
Yeah, so that is a great question. so that takes quite a bit of time. So a lot of the team here have gone on some in-depth training courses with psychology professors. We also work in close partnership with the University of Kent and their kind of psychology department to validate some of our processes for collecting this information. But it ultimately comes down to really somebody sitting in front of the data and trying to spot trends and trying to spot patterns. So we aggregate the data for certain elements. So this chart shows the same product page, but aggregated across the various different elements. So product image, video buttons, size, thumbnails, call to action, so on and so forth. And it shows the same information. So revisit, so we can see that the product image was revisited a number of times. And quite a lot of time was spent on it, whereas the actual main call to action button was again 10% of the time was spent on that page. But other elements like price and title, not so much time was spent on it. So once you aggregate all this information together, it's quite clear where your customer's focus is. So looking at this, if we were going to run some A/B tests with Sentient, some of the areas that we would look to kind of work on would be the product image, the CTA, and the size element, and potentially even the video button, because that is where the most of the customer's time is spent. There wouldn't be too much value in spending time based on this data alone, looking at things like the delivery element or the product title or the product price, because not much time is spent on it. And actually it takes the customers, in some cases, 23 seconds and above to actually even look at that element. So once you aggregate the data and pull it all together, you can then start to see where you should be kind of focusing your efforts on.
Got it.
Does that answer?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to HR Go. Talk about that.
Yeah. Like, how does this change how we work? So when we're running projects, some of our customers, a brief one on this. We run them in design sprints. And I mentioned it briefly earlier. You want to get to the point where you're learning from your ideas as quickly as possible. If you had come up with an idea, you build out a test, you write the code, you deploy the code. That's quite a lengthy process. Anybody who runs quite a large kind of UX team, I'm sure will be able to understand that that's quite a lengthy process. So Google came up with this methodology of design sprints, and we've kind of adopted that for how we work, but we also have modified it for biometrics. And this is really at the core of why biometrics is valuable in conjunction with a tool like Sentient. It is that it's not us necessarily coming up with the idea. The customers are telling us the areas of the site that they don't like. It's kind of undeniable, tangible data that there are areas of the site that they don't like. And by doing that, we can then focus our efforts and energy on kind of running tests in those areas. So, the customer comes up with the idea, UX teams, designers come up with a prototype. You can then put those prototypes back in front of the customers for kind of validation or disqualification. And then based on the customer feedback, you can then move on to, running an A/B test on that and validating it with kind of a larger segment of people. So that's kind of how we make sure that when we run tests, we have kind of a lower rate of failed tests or not as conclusive tests. If anyone's in a situation where they're running lots of tests and maybe there's not too much difference between the failed and the passed tests, what we found is some of our clients that we do this for, that as they start to kind of base their A/B tests on the biometrics, is that they're getting a higher percentage of more successful tests because you're testing in the areas that the customers are kind of telling you, is an issue. But just one thing before we kind of go on to the HR case study is that it's not all about finding kind of like negative areas of your site or sites that kind of was stopping people from converting. Something that we did quite successfully with another brand is competitor analysis. So we can actually run other people's through your site. So whilst you might be running biometrics on your own site to try and find areas that don't work quite well, if you go on competitors' sites, so in ASOS' example, we use Boho and Misguided, you can find elements which actually bring the customer joy, and then we can maybe try and adapt some kind of learnings from that and then build that into your own tests. So if there's something that your competitor is doing really well, you might want to try and replicate that and build that into your own design and build that into your own tests. And if there's something you're doing bad, you might want to try and change that as well. So there's a double-edged sword with the lab. That's another use for it.
Well, it's interesting. I think we typically think, what are the problems and how can we solve them? But in the competitive context, it's a great use case for biometrics.
Yeah, sure. So HR Go, I guess. Yep. These guys are a recruitment agency based in the UK. They've got bricks and mortars recruitment offices up and down the country. I think they've got about 440 recruitment offices up and down the country. And they've also got a online application portal where people can search for jobs and apply for jobs. Now, their conversion rate when we started with them was around 7%. Which in maybe B2C retail is considered quite high, but in recruitment that's actually quite low. So we wanted to run some tests on that. So what we did is we ran the website through the lab, and what we found is that, rather not unsurprisingly, like finding a new job is quite a stressful period of time for people. And so when you use, traditional techniques of conversion rate optimization, kind of forcing people down a conversion funnel, it actually turned off some of the applicants. So we wanted to try and build the site that kind of supported and guided customers rather than kind of forcing them down a certain conversion funnel.
And was that word choice? Was that design? How did you guide versus force?
Yeah, so it was a mixture of things. So yes, the language formed quite a big part of the tests that we ran in Sentient, but also the colours. The colours formed a large part of that, and then also the size of certain elements. Which I'll show you later, kind of some of the key learnings. But one of the other things between guiding and forcing was distraction. So you've got 3 different versions on those images there. From memory, I believe that the one in the foreground is the winning design. And you can see there by putting like an orange overlay over the main banner, it was a bit more soothing to the focus group, and also it reduced distractions. So that their focus wasn't taken to the children in the image in high-res color. It was kind of an overlay, and it brought the attention of the user down the page to where you actually wanted them to be focusing on the jobs. So, yeah, there you go. So that was the control and the winning design, and these changes took the conversion rate from 7%, as when we started off on the control, up to 17.8% for the winning design. So that was a substantial increase in conversion rate, 152.8% increase, I believe. Using Sentient.
That's a fairly staggering result. How big was the test? How many different changes did you test, and to how many different objects on the page?
Yeah, so one of the things of kind of using like the biometrics is it gives you loads of areas that you want to test. So there's loads of different elements, and like you said earlier, John, like even changing the words. There's so many elements, and so to build those all out in kind of traditional A/B testing tools, we know it would have taken us kind of a long time. I think this test, I've got it on the next slide, but this test resulted in over 1,000 different combinations. So I think it was 1,080 different possible combinations, which we ran over a period of 4 weeks using your tool. For us to have designed 1,000 different variations of a page and run them using kind of traditional methodologies, just wouldn't have been practical for either us or the client. Whilst this change was quite substantial, 7% to almost 18%, and the kind of the commercial value that gave the customer, the time and obviously the cost of our time to build out all of those tests wouldn't have made that, I guess, financially viable for the customer. So being able to put in all the individual tests and let them run, was a real result for us.
Yeah, that's interesting. We always tend to focus on the results that people get through experiments, but I know that the productivity side of automation, we're starting to hear more and more from our customers that's a very important part of the benefit from using AI to do testing. What did you learn from all this?
So yeah, I mean, lots of learnings here, but one of the big ones is that cumulative micro changes all add up. So when we started using Sentient, it made me think back to kind of previous A/B testing tools that we used, where we may have done multiple changes on a design and then tested that as a variant. And you never really know, were there certain design changes on that test that could have possibly been bringing the results down. So there were some design changes that obviously brought the results down. But because every test was broken down into a micro change, you can discard the negative ones and only focus on the positive ones. So that was a real learning point for us, and something that we want to continue to do is, rather than doing kind of large design changes, do lots of smaller ones, because it gives us the granularity to look at which ones actually directly affect conversion rate, and then discard the ones that don't. And then I guess in combination, if we're doing lots of smaller changes, you need to be able to kind of run those in kind of larger volumes. So we need to be able to kind of test those a lot quickly. And the other thing that we kind of often get said is, you know, biometrics then tells you what areas you should focus on, and that wasn't really the case. It just gives you an indication of the elements on the page that are more likely to give you positive tests. So that was a learning point, that we should just treat biometrics as another tool in conjunction with heat maps and other tools, but to give us an indication on certain elements of the tools.
This seems like a good time to open up the floor for questions. I know you have some more stuff to go through, but while you're doing that, I just wanted to encourage our audience to type in some questions, and after we go through these next slides, we'll put them to Alex.
Yeah, please, if anyone's got any questions, more than happy. So this is the test that we run. I don't know whether John, obviously, their tool, but you can see some of our best score was kind of 16%, best improvement over control was 6.7, and then our best percentage increase was 152%. We've seen there's 35 different elements that were changed there, and the bottom graph shows each individual test with the uplifts, and then you can see that some of those tests had significant uplift, so test 20 and test 28, you know, up to almost 10% uplift. But then some of the other tests, like test 8 and test 4 and test 12, had downshifts in conversion.
Yeah, just for those that are wondering, I know Alex had said, you know, there were 1,000 possible designs, but one of the attributes of Ascend is that it's a highly efficient fractional multivariate solution, so you can search through 1,000 designs while testing a very small fraction, such as these 35. We have a question from the audience, and they could get right to the nub of it, which is sort of how do you charge and what's the model? Do you do sort of a one-time, is it a one-time analysis, or do you do a monthly retainer if you're doing testing, biometric, and then running Ascend testing? How do you structure those engagements?
So yeah, absolutely. So thanks, Liz, for the question. Straight to the heart of it. And we generally recommend that biometric lab sessions are run quarterly, and out of a quarterly session, which usually lasts for about a week. Out of a quarterly session, you will have enough areas of conversion interest that you can then build out and implement into tests with Sentient or any other testing platform. But yeah, after using the lab once every quarter, that should give you enough tests to implement and run with. And then by all means, if you want to engage us on a quarterly retainer, yeah, we're open to that. So some of our clients, we do 4 lab sessions a year for them, and that's run every quarter, and then the output of those is all the tests that they put into Sentient.
We have another question from Sarah, who wanted to know, you know, what are the key metrics of success that you were looking at, I guess both for this test and also for other tests that you do? Is it engagement? Is it conversion? What are you tracking in terms of what makes success?
Yes, I mean, that is defined generally by the customer on kind of a case-by-case basis. I mean, John, you might be able to shed some light on this, but really for Sentient to be really, really successful, we need quite a clearly defined conversion goal. So in HR Go's case, it was job applications, and that was the metric. And in, I guess, traditional e-commerce solutions, it is kind of purchases. But we can set that metric to anything that's trackable within Sentient. A bit more broadly, if you want to use the Biometrics Lab for any other applications, that is possible. So slightly off topic, but we work with solicitors here in the UK, and they have contracts, and we sit down some of their people in front of the lab and ask them to read a contract. And if the contract says, if you don't keep up payments, we'll send the bailiffs around your house and they'll take everything you've got, that obviously piques high fear. But so if you can reword that to maybe not so an aggressive terminology, we're also able to collect the data from that and advise. So if your application was articles and brand image, we can design tests that will kind of fulfill whatever your goals are.
Hey,
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it's great. Interesting question. I was wondering about this before from Elizabeth. How do you make sure that the people that you're surveying are representative of sort of the population of a whole? I mean, you have 8 people. The site has hundreds of thousands or millions of visitors. How do you pick and how do you screen to make sure you're getting the right, that you don't have sample bias, or is that an issue with biometrics actually?
So all really great questions. So we have a couple of options for sourcing candidates. One of the most popular ones is using a candidate-specific recruitment agency. But the important thing to pick up on here is that we can only run the focus groups for a small section of customers just due to practicalities, and that's where a tool like Sentient comes in to test it with a larger volume of your traffic in the customers. The purpose is to highlight quickly the areas that are more likely to give you gains. And what we found is really you only need about 5 people, because it's based on subconscious behavior. Imagine areas that need addressing as like a hole in the street. Once 3 or 4 people out of the 5 have fallen down that hole, you can pretty much safely say that everybody else walking down that street is also going to fall down that hole. So it didn't matter whether you put 12, 20, 30 people, they're more likely going to have an issue with the hole in the street. And that's what we found with kind of running up to about 8. So between 6 and 8 is a really good number, and you manage to uncover about 85, 90% of the issues that you're likely to uncover on a site. And then in terms of like practicalities of how do you actually source those customers, there's a variety of ways. So if you've got bricks and mortar shop, as I mentioned earlier, we can actually go into your stores with the lab and kind of pull people out of your stores for 20 minutes, offering them some kind of incentive to run the test. The other way some of our other customers do it is they use GeoIP tracking on their website, and if they notice that you pop up within a certain mile radius of one of their offices or where they're going to be running an event, so in central London, for example, they will invite you to that event, and again, they'll incentivize you with free shipping or a £100 voucher or something like that. Someone's mentioned GDPR just soon, sorry. Throwing GIP pop-ups is really good. And then the other way is through marketing. So if you use any marketing automation tools, segmenting, if you're running a test on the women's category of your fashion retail, you might want to use your kind of marketing segmentation tools to segment on all women who've purchased something from the women's category in the last 6 weeks, who shipped it to London, and then send them an email inviting them to kind of participate in your next focus group. So there's a variety of options, and we've generally found that people are quite positive being involved in this and becoming like brand ambassadors.
Is going back to the GDPR question, certainly on everyone's minds in that's doing business in Europe, including ours. Is any of this personally identifiable data? I mean, you probably ask for their names and stuff. That's definitely PII. But what do you do about GDPR and this kind of?
Yeah, so we set up as a data processor, so we don't become a data owner. So whoever our customer is that we're working for is actually the owner of that data. And then we go to lengths to anonymize the data. Because it's a focus group and we actually have people kind of in front of us at the time of testing, we get them to sign disclaimers that allows us to kind of process their data and their information. But as you've seen in some of the slides, when you actually look at the data, there is no identifiable kind of information there that says, Alex took 3 seconds for his eyes to fixate on this element. So touch wood, we've got no issues, and we've had various kind of consultants work with us to ensure that we're kind of complying to all the latest regulations.
Very key these days. I know we're coming to the end, so do you want to bring it home and get through the final slides?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, just to wrap up, I guess, on the XR case study. So some of the key learnings here that we found from this was that our primary color was far too aggressive, so we swapped them around, and we also introduced a kind of a tertiary color. Another interesting element was padding. So you notice on the original one, the padding was quite tight, and we found that inflated people's stress. And so by putting the padding out, things looked more even and people felt a lot more comfortable with the site. So it's interesting that kind of one test and one portion of the page using Sentient with all these different tests could actually be applied to various different elements across the site. And these kind of color schemes are now actually being rolled out across not only digital, but print and in-store branding. So a lot of learnings, really. But I guess if you're going to kind of take anything away from this is analyze customers' behavior before kind of designing and building tests will lead to much more successful tests. So if you are running A/B tests, try and really understand your customers before you start building those. And then test smaller and more often, because the incremental changes add up. I used to use the phrase compound interest, but I don't think anybody's getting any decent interest these days. but the idea is the same, that lots of little changes will add up to a big change. Yeah, and I guess that's the rest of the points there.
Fascinating stuff. Great information. Jeremy, did you have a poll? We have a final question, I think, for our faithful listeners here. But while Jeremy brings that up, I did want to thank you, Alex, for your time and for working with us. Really fascinating stuff. I think it's an area of analysis that will be increasingly important as designs continue to evolve, and look forward to seeing more great biometrics work. If people are interested in talking to Sentient or Space Between about their services, please let us know. Or if you just want us to send you the recording, we'll do that too. And with that, we will say thank you and goodbye.
Thanks for listening, guys.